Hello and welcome to a grand tour with my great-great-granddad. My name is Ed Hill and this is episode 54 of the podcast that revolves around the history and journals of my late great-great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Scott, written way back in the 1840s about his travels, firstly around Europe and later on in Mexico. So if you're tuning in again, thanks very much. And I hope you've enjoyed watching and listening to the podcast and videos so far. If you're tuning in for the first time, then as the number suggests, there's plenty more episodes before this one to listen to, basically up to about episode 39. That covers all his time travelling around Europe. Basically, just to explain, my great-great-grandfather was a early steam pioneer, really, or steam engineer. And so his first job that he gets is working as a railway engineer and train driver in a very early railway in Italy, which ran from Monza to Milan. And so he has that job for about 2 years, and then he becomes basically a steam engineer again, but this time working in the mint in Mexico, basically introducing steam power to help mechanize the process of producing coins. So that is really the whole kind of cover of the journals. But as I say, in terms of the podcast, if you go to episode sort of 39, that covers his travels around Europe. And then from then on, it's his travels across the Atlantic by paddle steamer over to Mexico and then into the centre of Mexico to Zacatecas, which is a famous sort of silver mining area. And at that time, Mexico was known, actually it still is, it's still a very big producer of silver, but at that time particularly it was very known for producing silver coins, and particularly the 8 real, or you may have heard it in sort of pirate stories, the piece of 8. Pieces of eight, that whole thing. Because those were, at that time, a kind of universally recognised currency around the world. So that's why they were so valuable to pirates, basically. It's a bit like the modern-day American dollar. The 8 real or piece of 8, the silver Mexican dollar, as it was also known, that was universally accepted as a currency around the world. And basically, when William is travelling to Mexico, he's part of a whole kind of swathe of European miners and engineers who were, after Mexico had won its revolution against Spain to get its independence, it was trying to revive its economy. And to do this, it very much wanted to get investment back into its mines and its silver industry. And so it was encouraging countries from around the world, other than Spain, to get involved. And so William is part of a kind of whole cohort of people migrating from Europe to take up the opportunities available in this industry. There were quite a lot of Germans as well, I think, and there were also Irish people and, English, particularly Cornish miners. A lot of them came over from the tin mining industry in the UK to work in Mexico in the silver mining industry. And William happens to be, I suppose, with his expertise in steam power, an engineer brought into the coin making part of the operation. So just say, before I begin the actual podcast, what I normally do is I just mention a few ways in which you can contact me directly if you want to talk about the podcast through social media. There's a Twitter account or X account, and that is Scott of the Historic, and that is 3G at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. And so that is an easy way to get hold of me. Scott of the Historic at 3G Grand Tour. So that's the number 3 Grand Tour. There's a Blue Sky account. I always have to read this one to remind myself of it. That's Blue Sky. So that's at scottsgrandtour.bsky.social. And then there's also a Facebook page, and this is probably the easiest one to remember, which is simply at Grand Tour with my great granddad. So if you look up any of those social media channels, you'll find the podcast, and you can direct message me there about anything you want to talk about. If it's caught your interest, to make a comment or just say how much you're enjoying the podcast or whatever. It's always great to hear back from people, to get some feedback, and also to talk about the history, which I may have got wrong, because I'm only really doing my own research, and I'm not a professional, not a professional historian. And so there may well be things that you know more about than I do, and or perhaps there's extra information you could add as well. Once had someone from Italy who's actually living out in Monza and travelled the same railway journey as my great-great-grandfather, and so we started up a great correspondence then about how the kind of sights and sounds had changed since my grandfather had been working on the radio, and in fact he walked the line as much as he could, which still exists today. So it's great, the sort of engagement that you can get. So another thing that I always do also at the beginning of each episode is I say a little bit about where we were at the end of the last episode and where we're going with the next episode. And at the end of the last episode 53, William had been describing the sort of attire of what a well-dressed and suited and booted Mexican would have worn on horseback to parade around the Alameda and show off his wealth and his social standing on his horse, with all the various sort of bells and whistles and ribbons and things. So these outfits were quite expensive. So we'll have been talking about all that, and then also what fashionable women would have been wearing at that time. He'd also been involved in talking to an old Spanish soldier who'd been involved in fighting the Apache Indians, in the north of Mexico. So it's quite an eventful episode, that one. And in this one, it starts slightly unusually. He begins by this saying this phrase, manners and customs, basically. And so then he goes into describing, if you like, the marriage kind of traditions and courtship traditions of Mexico. But he's also helped by an account of a lady who he doesn't say what her name is, which is very frustrating. He doesn't say what her name is, but she'd also written an account that he then had copies, because he said she kindly wrote it down for me. So he then copies this into his journal, and she gives this account of staying at a home where there had been 3 daughters, and she then describes how the courtship process was happening with the last and youngest daughter, and of course it's very different tradition to how William would be used to back in the UK, and William then also discusses observing a more, I suppose you say, a more middle class, because her description is of sort of kind of high society class type of courtship, and then his description is then of a kind of more middle class type of courtship going in Mexico at that time. So that's basically it. I do hope you enjoy this episode. Manners and Customs, a Mexican Wedding. I had an opportunity of seeing a wedding the other day. When I entered the church, the bride-elect was on her knees between her 2 bridesmaids. All 3 were dressed in black silk and had their mantillas drawn close over their heads. The youngest lady sported a pair of white silk stockings and pale blue satin shoes, which was the only attempt at finery amongst them. The bridegroom wore a cloak of brown cloth with gilt buttons on the shoulders. I never saw a more grotesque bridal costume. As I entered the church, each of the gentlemen was presented with a long wax candle ornamented with painted flowers and gold leaf, which he held lighted during the whole ceremony. The matrimonial rites were very simple. The contracting parties followed the rector to the extreme end of the aisle. Close to the door entrance, a short prayer was read. The lady repeated a few Latin sentences after the priest, and the gentleman followed her example. One hand of each, during this portion of the ceremony, being covered up, clasped together in the robe of the priest. These at the conclusion of what I suppose was a mutual vow of acceptance. He sprinkled with holy water. The ladies then knelt down at the church door, while the bridegroom and his companions followed the rector to the altar, where they remained for about 2 minutes, when the bridegroom very deliberately walked out of the church, followed by his 2 friends, scattering sweetmeats as they went to a crowd of dirty children who thronged the entrance. And thus he made his exit in a manner as anti-bridal as his costume, leaving the ladies to follow as they might. And these people, I was told, were highly respectable and tolerably wealthy. It is not only possible, but extremely probable, that this couple had never exchanged a word in their lives, it being considered in this country as the height of indecorum, even for an accepted lover, to visit at the house of his mistress, except in the lower ranks, where convenience is the stepdame, so stepdame is another word for stepmother, is the stepdame of custom. As proof of this fact, I shall here insert a narrative I received from an English lady who had been many years in this country and is now married and settled here, and as she was kind enough to write it down for me, I shall use her own words. So then we get an account written by this lady of the courting ritual that she observes at this time. Unfortunately, William never says her name. So it's sort of implicit, really, of the whole, male bigotry, I suppose you'd say, of it. He doesn't even have the grace to mention her name. I shall just write down what she wrote. He could have at least acknowledged her name, couldn't he? But there we are. Such was the times, I suppose. Anyway, this is now her giving an account of what she witnessed when she was travelling in Mexico as regards the courtship custom. Some years ago, and previous to my marriage, I was travelling with my father when we stopped a few days in the city of Guadalajara. The head of the house where we were staying was a widower and father of 4 daughters, the elder of whom was married to an attorney, the other 3 being still resident under the paternal roof. They were the least attractive specimens of the sex that I ever remember to have seen, with the same advantages of station and respectability. Daniel Lambert. So she's now making reference to a gentleman in England who was well known for being very fat. He was called Daniel Lambert, and he was from Leicester, and he was recorded as weighing 50 stone. So he was a folk hero figure. So basically she's saying one of these daughters was very, very fat. She's really quite judgmental here about these poor girls. Anyway, I'll read that sentence. You'll understand then who she's referring to when she says Daniel Lambert. Daniel Lambert would scarcely have exceeded the elder in weight and circumference. The second was like a leaf of dry tobacco, as long as thin and tawny, so that's a yellowy brown colour, and uninteresting, and the younger had a form like a feather pillow and a face like a sheep. It's nice to know your friends are, isn't it? Anyway. The centre grace was a bride-elect, and in a fit of extreme courtesy, she one day asked me if I should like to see her lover. Of course, I expressed a becoming anxiety on the subject, and I was decided to hold myself in readiness at 6 that evening. I confess that I was curious to see the suitor of such a mistress, and I accordingly promised to be punctual. 6 o'clock came, and I was astonished on walking into the apartment, usually occupied by the family, to find the fair one alone, who, having embraced me, led me to a chair on the balcony, and established herself directly by my side. She then carefully drew the blind over the balcony, leaving us visible only from the 2 extremities of the said screen. All this ceremony was perfectly enigmatical to me, and I began to apprehend that I was to have the honour and happiness of being number 3 in a thorough love scene. With this fear before my eyes, I ventured to inquire whether we should not be more conveniently situated in the room than the balcony. But the lady looked quite astonished, as she demanded in her turn how she would be able to see him, and worse still, how he would be able to see her if we were not on the balcony when he passed. Is he then not coming to visit you? I inquired, in my ignorance, as I surveyed her careful coiffure, her clean dress, and the tale-telling carnation in her bosom. She looked at me for a moment in perfect astonishment, and then coolly informed me that in Mexico, holding any intercourse with the man whom you were to marry was a thing unheard of, that she had never spoken to her intended husband in her life, but that he every day sent a carnation to her, which she wore in her bosom each evening at the hour when she expected him to pass the house, as proof that his intentions were agreeable to her. And she assured me that nothing would offend her so much as his allowing the weather, be what it might, business, be it never so important, or any occupation, be it as agreeable as a heart could wish, to interfere with this punctuality in the performance of his duty. The first time she should resent the neglect by omitting to wear his carnation on the morrow, and the second dereliction from gallantry would infallibly subject him to final and irrevocable dismission. At this period of the conversation, the seigneur made his appearance, took off his hat as gravely as though he had been passing a funeral, and walked on. The lady on her side bowed and smiled, and then continued calmly to enlighten me on the subject of Mexican courtship. She informed me, among other equally interesting particulars, that I now knew the reason why she did not comb out her hair and wash her face when she rose in the morning, for both which indelicate habits I had frequently chidden her. Chided her. Sounds like she'd often nagged her about it. She doesn't sound like a great house guest, really, isn't she? A bit judgmental, telling you what you shouldn't be doing. Anyway. And she explained that she always put off her ablutions and their concomitant ceremonies until 5 o'clock, in order that she might look nice and fresh when she met the passing glance of her lover. This was, of course, an unanswerable argument, and having remarked that the lover, one, was a little ill-looking fellow and decidedly many years younger than herself, I asked her if she did not feel unhappy at the idea of marrying a man of whom she knew nothing. The reply to this question was sensible to the full, as her previous reasoning had been. She liked the match extremely, for her intended husband was much more wealthy than the person who had married her sister, and she should consequently be enabled to dress better and give larger parties, besides which single women are not allowed to attend fandangos, and she was passionately fond of dancing. All this being extremely satisfactory, I had only one more question to ask. How had he ventured to propose to her? That also was easily explained. He was settled in life, and his friends were anxious he should marry. Her father, having ascertained the fact, and knowing that he had mucho moneda, i.e. a lot of money, had offered her to his family, which offer, as she had a fortune of $4,000, they had joyfully accepted. So that was the end of this lady's description of her encounter with this particular way of courtship going on in Mexico. And then William continues to tell his observations about it. So much for what are called the higher classes here. Now the middle ones. And what has occurred under my own eyes may now at this very time, morning and evening, still be in progress. Directly passing my department of the mint resides a family who has got 2 or 3 tolerably pretty daughters. One of these has, it seems, taken the fancy of a young man, a clerk in one of the mercantile establishments here. Every morning at 6 o'clock he regularly parades the street for the purpose of seeing and being seen by his inamorato. That's another word for sweetheart. But they go a step further than the last mentioned. They converse together. But how think you, my fair countrywomen? Why, across the street. I have many times seen the gentleman coming down the same side of the street on which the dwelling of his fair one is situated, and a short distance before he reaches it, he invariably crosses to the other side, and then the conversation commences at a safe distance. So much for Mexican courtship, so much for the customs of this semi-barbarous country. When I look back at the events of my own life, I cannot but despise the system followed here. Many times after a day of toil and hardship, I have left the noise and turmoil of a busy city, and in the green and smiling fields have held communion with a soul congenial to my own. These, my fellow countrymen and fair countrywomen, are the happiest moments of our existence, of which those Mexicans have not the slightest idea. And though many years have passed over my head since those events took place, and the wild Atlantic now rolls betwixt me and my native land, still does fancy yet assert her dominion, and in the visions of the night carry me back to the much-loved scenes of my youth. In England, by allowing a free intercourse between the sexes, they have a chance of becoming acquainted with each other's characters, so there are fewer really unhappy marriages there than in other countries. But here, being nearly strangers to each other, they soon become dissatisfied. The husband flies to other females for consolation, and the wife follows his example. And through these means, the greatest licentiousness and immorality prevails throughout the country. Indeed, to such a pitch is it carried that a married female will think nothing of sending a message to a man she has never spoken to, and desire the favour of his company. This I do know for a positive fact, though I shall not mention names, nor any further particulars, though had I not been a witness to such things, I could not have believed that such passions could have found a place in a female breast, especially in the situation of life some of them occupy. Okay, I'd just like to stop here at this point in the journal just to obviously talk about a few things that have come up. The first thing that caught my interest is obviously this long description of a courtship that happens that this lady gives, that William frustratingly doesn't say her name, which I think I said, it just goes to show sort of general attitude towards sort of gender and stuff at that time. It just doesn't think it's worthy to mention her name in the journal. I don't know, just very odd, but there we are. You'd think he'd at least just say, I'm indebted to so-and-so who gave me this account, but anyway. Probably the description of this, what they call balcony courtship that she gives, would have been for the sort of, more well-to-do higher classes of people in Mexico at that time. And also her account is a little bit older because she's saying it happened when she was some years ago in Guadalajara as well. So, it probably even by William's time, this sort of thing wasn't changing, and it would have been quite a rare example of this type of courtship being this extreme and strict. But it certainly did go on, and there was a tradition of it, and there was this whole idea of kind of wearing a flower in your bosom, as you say, to reveal your happiness or displeasure to the young man as he walked past the balcony and stuff like this, the young suitor. And of course there would have been a lot of family involvement as well. Basically these kind of relationships were marriages were transactional, and money was involved and status and all that sort of stuff. So they were essentially arranged marriages, really. But as the lady said at the end, well, I'm going to get a wealthy husband, I'm going to have better clothes, bigger parties, and I'll be able to go to dances, which I enjoy doing because single women aren't allowed to. And as the lady says, the reasoning behind that is perfectly understandable and rational. So, but it's, the one thing that does strike me, as I think I mentioned, is, she's quite a mean person about these people. At the end of the day, they're pushing her up. She's not a very nice guest, really. She's very judgmental about these poor daughters that live in this household. So, she always strikes me as a bit mean. Anyway, just moving on for that, obviously then William gives his sort of version of a more middle class version of this, where it's the exchanges happen across the street and not behind a sort of balcony and a screen, but again, it was all about respectability, really, and these sort of traditions. Now, I think what's quite funny is William then gives this sort of romantic account of how this is wrong and how, courtship in Britain would be so much more natural, and, this almost writes this visage of young couples walking through the woods, picking flowers and reading poetry to each other, and all that is kind of a bit over the top, really. He says, it discourages husbands from going off and meeting other women and all this, and at the same time, prostitution was rife in Britain at that time and all this sort of stuff. So, these marital dalliances, extramarital dalliances were going on all the time, and of course they still do. So, he's sort of a bit of a pot calling the kettle black there, really. But of course, you've got to understand he is coming very much from this sort of Protestant background, and as we've sort of discussed before, there's this almost attitude of kind of making something different being also sort of deficient in some way as well. Will comes from that background, but sort of rather judgmental background, which is a sort of shame. But it seems to be the way a lot of travellers were that time. And on some degree, people still like it, aren't they? They still don't like foreign food. Well, why go abroad then if you don't like foreign food? It's that kind of similar impetus. I mean, if I go travelling, you celebrate the differences and enjoy them and think, oh, wow, it's interesting how they do that there. But at that time, there was also this kind of element of making judgments about what you're observing and almost always coming from a sort of superior point of view. And obviously William comes from this, I would say, more Protestant background. And I think there's probably something also about, because he does encounter these things in Italy as well, which he often brings up as well as being odd, as but I think there's perhaps a particular Mexican spin on these things that make them stand out and be more, I suppose, idiosyncratically Mexican, that in some ways seem more different to him. But it's nice to hear this sort of account anyway, isn't it? And I suppose you would say, of course, this sort of stuff was reserved for the higher classes, for the people with money. The lower classes just got on with it, basically. They just met and got married. And you could say there's one advantage of being poor. At least you didn't have to get lumbered with some blooming, this poor suitor that this girl's going to get. She's obviously quite a large lady, and he's younger and smaller. But you could say at least some lady's not going to be lumbered with a 5-stone weakling. If she was poor, you just married who you wanted to. Yeah. Right, the next thing I'd like to talk about as well is this character, Daniel Lambert, that the lady mentions in her description of courtship, when she makes this comparison to this unfortunately large daughter that she's staying with in this rather cruel way that she's got of describing things. So just to say a little bit more about Daniel Lambert, basically he lived around about the late 1700s, early 1800s, and he kind of became a well-known figure in the whole country, basically, primarily because he was a very large, fat man. In fact, he was at the time known as the man recorded as the largest ever in history. He basically, at the height of his weight, he was more than 50 stone, basically. He's about 52 to 53 stone. Now, he was born in Leicester in around about 1777, I think, something like that. And he started off life, apparently, when he was a sort of younger man, as not particularly fat. In fact, he was known as being quite an athletic, sporty type. And he had the job of being the jailer in the town of Stamford, I think, which was where he was born in Leicester. And he was quite well known, apparently, as a good jailer. He inherited the job from his father. He was thought to be quite liberal with the prisoners, in fact, quite liked by the prisoners. But in his early 20s, he suddenly gained a lot of weight very rapidly. And so he went from being, the average weight. Well, by the time he was 33, as I say, he was more than 50 stone. And of course, he became known sort of locally for this fact. Unfortunately, he then lost his job as the jailer. So as a way to make a bit of money, he decided he'd make the most of his assets, as it were. And he decided to travel to London. I think they say he even had to have a special carriage built for him. But anyway, I'm a bit sceptical about that. But anyway, he travelled to London. He took up residency in a sort of apartment in Piccadilly. And he would then charge people to come and see him. Basically, it's a shilling a time to visit him. And this is what happened, basically. And he became well known in London as a figure. of interest. He wasn't really, I wouldn't say kind of mocked for his largeness and overweight figure. He was more, I would say, treated as a kind of character of interest and oddity, really. In cartoons of the time, he's often depicted as a sort of John Bull character, so maybe there was an element of this sort of the largeness of him in some way was identified with being English and stuff as well. I don't know. When people came to visit him, he mainly wanted to talk about what his main area of interest was, which was actually sort of breeding livestock and animals, so cows and sheep and pigs and things like that. So he tended not to talk too much about his weight and encourages visitors not to talk too much about his weight. He insisted as a mark of respect that they remove their hat when they came to visit him, and if they didn't, he could get pretty churlish with them. But yeah, slowly he became well known. I think even George III, he met with him. I don't think he visited him in the apartment, but he certainly met with him. And most people say he was actually a very good conversationalist. He was very interesting on the subject of, breeding animals and stuff like that. So he was, moved in sort of high society in a way. Although how much he actually moved might be in question. There was also kind of another famous incident in his life where he met also one of the smallest men in history known at that time, who was a chap from Poland. He'd been in the royal court in Poland. They described him as the court's dwarf. I suppose it's a bit like being the court jester, but he was the last of his kind. He was a chap called Joseph Borolowski, I think, and he was 3'3" tall. And this meeting of the two of them together became a big kind of national event, a lot of speculation about it. And apparently in one of the papers it was described as Falstaff meets Tom Thumb. So that was another big sort of incident in his life. Basically, this Joseph Pulaski, he'd ended up living in England. And I think he ended up living in somewhere like Durham in the end eventually, and saw the end of his days out there. But unfortunately for Daniel Lambert, his ending wasn't quite so happy. He got a bit disillusioned in the end by people only really being interested in his being large and overweight, and he moved back to Leicester, and he died in 1808 at a relatively young age, in his 30s, and yeah, and not very wealthy. I think he spent most of his money. In fact, they say here, I think it says something like his coffin required, let me have a look, it was 112 square feet of elm to build his coffin. They had to remove a wall from the inn that he was staying in to actually get him out of the building to take him to the cemetery. I think they made some sort of special cart for him, but apparently it took 20 men to manoeuvre him into his, I imagine, fairly large grave. Anyway, so that was the end of his life. Apparently, the football team in Stamford FC or AFC, their nickname is the Daniels. Apparently, after his fame. But really, that's the kind of interesting thing. I suppose you could almost say he was like a celebrity in the days, in the very early days of being a celebrity, in the sense that he wasn't a well-known writer or painter or actor or anything like that. He was just famous for being, this large chap. And so I suppose you could say he was the first person to have that kind of so-called phenomenon of having their 15 minutes of fame, although his fame went on for more than 15 minutes. But certainly, that time media was beginning to be created. There were local and daily newspapers and magazines and periodicals. So, it was, if you like, the beginning of that whole nature of fame that we're kind of more familiar with today. sickness, death, and treatment of the dead. When a person here is seized with any malady that is likely to prove fatal, and the attendants fancy the end of a person is approaching, the first thing is to send for the priest to administer extreme unction to the dying person. This is an object of considerable ceremony, and even in the state of their thinking, it shows the power of the priesthood over the minds of the people. The priest being apprised of the fact of a person approaching his end, and everything being prepared, the procession sets out as follows. First, a person ringing a large handbell to give notice to all those on the route to pray for the soul of the departing Christian. Then a man bearing a banner after him follows another with a small altar table on his head, and then a large old-fashioned carriage drawn by 2 mules, with the postilion in a red jacket. In this carriage is the priest in his robes and carrying the host, the holy bread of the Eucharist. Facing him sit 2 boys carrying lanthorns. It's just another word for lanterns, with lighted candles in them. There are also 4 men who walk at each corner of the carriage, carrying lanterns on long poles, and the procession is generally closed by all the dirty, idle and ragged children in the town. At the sound of the bell, all the inhabitants rush to their doors and to the corner of the streets, and go down upon their knees, bareheaded, till the procession is out of sight. As soon as the breath has left the body, it is taken and placed in the friar's habit, and is then laid out on the bare floor opposite to the front door, which is wide open, and several candles placed around it. Here it generally lays for 2 days, when it is placed in a sort of shell, bearing a great resemblance to a butcher's tray, hoisted onto the shoulder of 4 men, and hurried off to the Campo Santo, or burying ground. Here it is taken from the coffin, the friar's habit stripped off, thrown onto a shallow grave of about 2 feet in depth, and there is an end of Señor Mexicana. August 15th, Festival of the Annunciation of Nuestra Senora. This is considered to be one of the most important religious festivals of the year, especially in the village of Guadalupe, which I have mentioned before as being situated a league distant from Zacatecas, though the way the Mexicans spent the day will appear rather strange to English readers. The Virgin Mary is considered as the patron saint of this highly enlightened and liberal republic. This is their idea, though the way they do her honour at her numerous festivals is rather strange. I had been told there would be something very grand, and the morning being particularly fine, I was in the saddle at 6 o'clock, and riding gently down, I reached Guadalupe about 7. The road between the 2 places was crowded with people of all ranks and classes, from the wealthy citizen with his gold-embroidered manga, that's his sleeves, and spirited horse, to old women and young ones mounted on donkeys. The mules and donkeys was enjoying a day's rest by doing double the work they did on other occasions, besides having an additional number of kicks and thumps from the biped that bestrode them. Great was the variety of form and feature, and greater still was the number of colours that composed the dresses of the females. Considerable also was the number of mishaps that occurred to the fairer part of the creation, from the wayward propensity and stupidity of those beasts of burden upon whom they had trusted their lovely persons. Great numbers of those animals had never carried anything but bags of ore, stones, and other materials of that description, and wondering at the strange and shifting burden they had got on their backs, often took the liberty of placing their fair riders on the ground before them. This being a particularly easy matter, as the ladies was mounted on lofty pack saddles, and the animal had no bridles. Great as the various colours was, in which the fair sex was clad, it was not greater than that of their own complexions. For there was all shades from the delicate white, the blue eyes, and the flaxen hair of the Anglo-Saxon, to the jet-black hair, the flashing eyes, and the dark brown of the pure Indian. When we reached Guadalupe, I found the plaza crowded with people, and observing a great number of circular tents, I inquired what they were for, and was immediately answered, gambling booths. Leaving our horses, we proceeded for a stroll on foot, and approaching the gambling booths, I found them crowded with persons of both sexes. In fact, gambling is a mania that affects all ranks and classes in Mexico. It amounts almost to insanity. As my curiosity was soon satisfied at this point, I proceeded with a friend to visit the celebrated Franciscan convent situated on one side of the great plaza. It is a very large establishment, and for this country well fitted up in the interior. It contains a large collection of paintings, mostly of scriptural subjects and of very mediocre quality. The church attached to the convent is a tolerably fine building, and at the time of my visit was crowded to excess as the Mexicans go to the gaming tables with a clear conscience if they have been to Mass previous. I saw several of the monks, but amongst them I only noticed one face that possessed the slightest trace of intellectual power. All the others possessed considerably more of the animal than the intellectual. After this visit, I took a ride over the plains and returned to Zacatecas about 2. In the evening, accompanied by 2 friends, I again took a ride down to the same place, and the crowd was at that time considerably greater than it had been at the former part of the day. Indeed, the saying was literally fulfilled, viz. That Zacatecas had removed itself to Guadalupe. The mania of the gambling had reached its height, but with the descending sun, the excited groups began to depart, and then came awe, the moving accidents of flood and field, to which through grumbling we were forced to yield. And though serious and sundry were the blows and cuffs inflicted on the poor animals in the former part of the day, they bore no relation to those which fell to their lot at the finish of it. Nor was there wanting a certain quantity of music to give life and animation to this motley scene. The rushing of the diligences and the calls and curses of the drivers to clear the way, the braying of the donkeys, the shrieking of women, and the crying was enough to make confusion worse and confounded. Just at the entrance of Zacatecas, a number of youngsters had stationed themselves with long painted sticks, and when a party of females passed them, mounted on donkeys, they rushed into the midst, and by pricking the animals behind, caused them to kick, and in many instances to throw their riders, to the great amusement and mirth of the bystanders. As 2 of my friends had walked down to the village, they would be like other people in returning, and so mounted themselves on a couple of donkeys. One of my friends had learned a trick by travelling amongst the Indians, and was no sooner mounted than he began whistling into the animal's ears, which caused it to set off at full speed, to the great annoyance of the owner, who had to follow on foot, and beguiled the way by continually muttering curses and exclamations on the head of the unfortunate Englishman, who, perfectly understanding the language, was enjoying himself at the other's mortification. As for my own part, I did not come to much better off than the rest, my horse taking fright several times and very nearly unhorsing me. But however, although an indifferent horseman, I managed to keep on his back. The Mexican horses, although the most superior horses for travelling, are not suited to a crowd. At about 9 we finished the day, and I retired to rest, considerably well tired. Okay, I'm stopping again now to talk about this last section. And obviously William gives this very vivid account of this festival that he describes. Now, he calls it the Festival of the Annunciation, I think, but I think he might have misheard, or, as I said before, Spanish isn't his first language, because at this time of year it actually would have been what's known as the Festival of the Assumption, that happened during August. But it's a very vivid account William gives, but virtually like of the whole city of Zacatecas going to Guadalupe, on these poor horses and mules that you're normally used to carrying heavy loads of silver and other cargo, and now have to carry heavy loads of wriggling women who have a tendency to fall off. As you say, on this holiday, the poor mules are having to do more work than they would normally do. And again, obviously, it's written from this perspective of Will observing, the gambling and all this sort of stuff going on. Basically, it's a festival. It's people are going to have a good time, aren't they? William says, well, I've been to confession, so they're happy to gamble after they've done that, which is, pretty well true, really. So, but yeah, people are going to meet up, have a good time. There are a lot of these festivals in Mexico during this time, and they'll become quite repetitive. So I won't keep commenting on them, I don't think. Just the particular one of this one, though, the sort of worshipping of this Lady of Guadalupe that happens in Mexico is particularly sort of significant for the country, because the Virgin of Guadalupe is a kind of particular version of what they call Marian devotion, obviously devotion to Mary is a sort of tradition in Catholicism. As we all know, you only got to go to any Catholic church and see how many portraits there are of her holding a baby, maybe. I don't know what his name is. And because she almost becomes more important than Jesus, doesn't she? In my sort of view of my layman's view of Catholicism. Anyway, but the thing that's kind of important in Mexico is that obviously there was this tradition, and it kind of goes back right to the 1500s when the Lady of Guadalupe first appeared. Now, the important thing about this is that she didn't appear in, what you could say the more traditional looking version of Mary that we all know. That, as I say, if you go to any Catholic church, let's say the classical Italianesque version of her, she appeared to a native Mexican, firstly, which is important, and she appeared at a site of what was an historical important site culturally for that indigenous people as well. And she also spoke to this native Mexican Indian who's got the most very Spanish name. It's Juan Diego, so that sort of threw me because it's a very Spanish sounding name. But he was actually a native Mexican, and she also spoke to him in the native Mexican language, which I can't quite say it very well. I think it's called Nahulute, something like that. Anyway, so this was an important factor, and also her appearance was slightly Indian as well. Apparently, she had darker skin, and she kind of looked more like a native Mexican than, as I say, the traditional view we would have of the Virgin Mary as well. And so, really culturally, she's become a very important figure in Mexico in its own particular version of Mary, really, and Marian devotion. And as time went by, this tradition of hers became stronger. She became a very important national figure. And in fact, when the Mexican Revolution against Spain happened, the leader of the revolt at that time, who was President Miguel Hidalgo, he sort of chose her as the symbol of national identity, because in a way she united all the peoples of Mexico. She united the Spanish, the native Indians and indigenous peoples, and also what they called mestizo, the mixed peoples as well, who'd come together as well. They put her on the flag, basically, when they went into battle. She was on the flag. And I think they had a battle cry. It was something, what was it? Viva la Virgin de Guadalupe. That's what they said as they went into battle, apparently. I think my cry as I went into battle would be, please don't let me die. Anyway, but I'm not cut out to be a soldier. But I think it's important just to say at this point, to give you an idea of this particular version of Catholicism and Marian devotion, because it's something that William observes, and I think that's maybe why it's particularly sort of noticeable to him, because of this it's a particular Mexican spin of using symbols in Catholicism. August 18th, Sunday. There has been a religious procession this evening from the Church of San Augustine, but so similar to those that I have described before that I shall not content myself with recording the fact. The only difference to those exhibitions on the present occasion being that the priests were accompanied by a considerable body of soldiers, with their officers in full costume. Vesper bell 8 minutes before 7. August 19th. Another religious procession this evening from a small chapel close to my residence. The moon had risen before the parties returned, and they remained singing for nearly an hour in front of the chapel. The effect of the music was very good, and a large concourse of people had assembled. Though my opinions and theirs is most likely as wide as the poles asunder, yet I could not help feeling moved as the sweet voices rose and fell on the calm evening air. And I thought of dear old England, and the days that long passed, and passed too for ever. And I must here remark that, though I almost abhor many of the parts of the Roman Catholic creed, yet I never entered any of their places of worship without feeling my mind soothed by the influence of their singing and their music. There are some persons perhaps who would say, why, you could experience the same emotions in a theatre. But I say no. So, as I said before, different as my principles may be, I cannot enter their churches without the emotion crossing my mind that I stand in the presence of a power superior to man. And though they mostly worship things of wood and stone, yet that cannot hinder us in looking from nature up to nature's God. So the last thing I'm going to talk about here is, and I know it hasn't been very long since I last interrupted, but the last thing I want to talk about here was this phrase that William uses, through nature. We look at nature, through nature, up to nature's God. He makes this kind of allusion to this expression, and I remember the first time I read it I thought, well, he seems to assume we all know what he means by this term, nature's God. And so obviously I kind of looked into it a bit more. Is it a famous phrase? Now there may well be people out there who know exactly what he's referring to there, but I have to say in my ignorance I didn't. But really it's a whole term that was first coined by Alexander Pope in his work, the essay on the essay of man, and basically it's all to do with the Enlightenment, really. So this whole thing became very much an idea of viewing your perception of God in a, let's say, a more kind of rational way, or a more inherent natural way in nature, as opposed to the traditions of the Catholic Church, icons and paintings and sculptures and things like that. You see nature, you see God just in nature around you in the world, and not because a big church somewhere tells you to, and then does all these paintings and it kind of explains a story to you. It's kind of a way of coming to God yourself, really. And you could say it's a sort of more Protestant sort of view of religion in a way, the Christian religion. And it is, at that time, it would have been a phrase familiar to most people of a kind of middle class nature, relatively well educated background that William came from or comes from. It's actually also used in the American Declaration of Independence. Jefferson writes this phrase, "Nature's God." So it was a significant thing, and I remember when I read it, I thought, he seems to expect everyone to know what that means. And as I say, I didn't, because I haven't really studied the Enlightenment in great depth, really. It's also very telling in a way as well, because William's saying this thing about how, although he'll go into a Catholic church and he'll see all these icons made of wood and stone, crosses and statues and things like this, he still gets moved by the religious feeling, as it were. This is sort of what he's saying. But in him, he's sort of then saying, but it's my religious feeling of that nature, the nature's God, the rational kind of, the God that you sort of come to yourself by observing nature, observing the cat behind me and what it does in nature. It kind of helps to explain a little bit about William's whole view, really, of Catholicism in a way. You kind of get a better understanding of where he's coming from and his tradition, and this kind of, I suppose, you would say, being a Victorian engineer, sort of man of science in a way, his view of the world sort of clashing with this more traditional, ritualistic and iconographic icons, anyway, things like paintings, pictures, that, and also the whole festival thing and the celebrations and the stuff that happens in Catholic countries more than it does in Britain. So he's seeing it from that standpoint. So it kind of, in a way, it does explain a lot of his attitudes. Now, I know you're probably all looking at the cat now rather than me. And what are you doing, puss? I know. Anyway, right. So anyway, we just observed the cat for a bit, and you could observe nature's God in little Pengy there, the cat. Just having a good scratch, really. You're upstaging me, man. You're upstaging me. Doesn't care. Look at it. Silly old puss. Well, I always say, don't I? Never work with children and animals. So that's the end of episode 54. I hope you've enjoyed it. I think it's quite an interesting episode with all the various things that were going on, and I suppose a bit of an insight into particularly the kind of marriage conventions that were happening at that time in Mexico. Of course, it's very, very different now, and they were, as I'd said before, they were very much, certainly in the lady's description, certainly very much from the higher echelons of Mexican society. But yeah, I think it's quite a good episode. So just to sign off, as I usually say, if you do want to contact me, there's those ways that I mentioned before at the beginning of the video, which is the Twitter or X account, which is Scholarly Historic, and that's at 3G, that's the number 3, at 3G Grand Tour, and the Facebook page as well, which is at Grand Tour with my great granddad. And also then there's the Blue Sky account as well, which I think if you just search Ed Hill, and you'll see that one, and it will come up, should come up with details of the podcast on that account as well. And in the next episode, basically, William's getting very near Christmas time now in Mexico. So there's sort of the element of him describing not so much the sort of festivals of Christmas in Mexico at the time, which is slightly surprising, but just talking about his feelings about his time in Mexico, sort of summing up the year that has been in the previous 12 months and stuff like that, and his sort of observations on it. So that's where the next episode will begin. But that is it for episode 54 of A Grand Tour with my great granddad. I do hope that you've enjoyed it.